Hi, I'm FIDE Chess Master Jason Morefield, and today I'm going to be talking about fortresses in the endgame. So, what is a fortress? When you're talking about chess endgames and hear someone mentioning a fortress, they are referring to a setup that they believe to be impenetrable, as long as the fortress is maintained. These fortresses, if they are sound, typically result in a draw, because the attacking side cannot make progress against the defense as long as they stay put, and the defending side cannot attack the other side if they are staying put. However, this definition overlooks the fact that if some fortresses are much harder to keep together than others. I have for you today a few examples, the first of which arrives in quite a flashy way but results in a very interesting fortress. Here we have a pretty interesting position, and yeah, it's not a fortress yet. I'm giving you the position a few moves beforehand just so I can demonstrate what happened leading up to this. So, Black's position here is honestly pretty bad. White has a strong knight, the a5 pawn is weak, he has some room to maneuver and start attacking the a5 pawn, and if he can win it, his position will be very good. Black recognized this, and with his next move, he set, which seems to be a horrible blunder, he set a trap. His next move was queen to b6. Now, considering that this looks like pretty much a normal position, you might be like, wait, White should just take the queen. And he did, but that actually proved to be a mistake. Because after c takes at b6, you'll notice that the only possible way White can hope to ever make progress is now through the king side. And Black is currently threatening to play pawn to h4 to stop any progress on the king side forever. So White in the game played h4, trying to open up the queen side and create a path for the queen to go to h3. And if it can get there, well, the queen goes up into Black's position and starts eating pawns. It's no longer a fortress. So Black took the pawn on h4, and when White started to move closer to it, like planning queen e2, f1. Yeah, it's a long path. Black played h3, threatening h2 when White has to guard the promotion square and can never get through. So White captured the pawn, and after h4, a fortress has been set up. It's not normally as visual as this, but there's no possible way White can get through this fortress as long as Black doesn't get careless with the position of his king. The only possible ways that he could hope to make progress are taking on a5, which as long as Black doesn't get too far away, won't result in a winning passed pawn, or taking the bishop on g3, in which case Black gets his own passed pawn, which is honestly much more dangerous than anything White could come up with. The final position is a fortress, and I believe, I'm not sure, they probably agreed to a draw around here, because it's clear White can't do anything. However, not all fortresses arise in such flashy, interesting ways. Here is an example of a fortress where it is simply impossible to make any progress if Black does not blunder. You'll notice there are much fewer pieces on this one. So this fortress, White can't attack anything. That's the problem. The queen, everything in Black's position is defended. The pawn's defended by the king, and the rook's defended by the pawn. And for the next infinity moves, or probably 50 until the 50 move rule kicks in, Black is going to move his rook back and forth from e6 to g6. He'll move his king whenever it's checked, but make sure to keep protecting the pawn. And since White is unable to attack the pawn on f7 with more than one piece, he can't win. He can exchange the rook and pawn for the queen maybe, but then it's king versus king. So this position is a rather simple example of an unbreakable fortress. If Black moves his rook out, then maybe he's at risk of losing. Or if he moves his pawn, or if he puts his rook on an undefended square, maybe brings his king out in the open, then he'd be in danger of losing. But as long as he keeps this setup going, it's a draw. And here's another fortress. You don't even have to have a rook. Here's another fortress where Black doesn't have any major pieces, but they still manage to hold a draw against the queen. And this is because of two things. One, again, everything is protected, and White has only a king and queen. So the only way white can win this position is to attack something with more than one piece. But this is where the problem sets in. Black's bishop is controlling all of these squares. Black's knight is controlling all of these squares. You may notice that this forms an impenetrable barrier that the white king cannot cross. The king cannot even attack the bishop. And so the only way white can hope for a win is like seeing if black can run out of moves. Maybe he can put him in Zugzwang, like force him to move and then you win. However, he can't do that. No matter how close he tries to get, let's give it a couple moves for example, he can never make black truly run out of moves. Even if white plays like queen e6, queen e8, black can play bishop h8 and the fortress still stands. You'll notice queen g6 checkmate is impossible because the knight's guarding it. So you can't even checkmate, much less win the bishop. Well, I mean, checkmate's more important than the bishop, but you get what I mean. Now, the three examples I've shown you so far are all examples of impenetrable fortresses, or fortresses that act the way they are intended. However, not all fortresses are solid. Many can be broken in one way or another. For example, let's take one of the pictured positions we showed earlier and add one pawn. This position looks pretty familiar, doesn't it? All I changed was I added a white pawn on g5. And at first glance, that might not seem to change much of anything. I mean, can't he just go rook g6, rook e6, rook g6, rook e6 over and over and over again and still draw? Isn't the king still locked out? Yes, but it's not a draw. Because white has an additional resource, which he didn't have before. That of transposing into a pawn endgame that's winning. With queen takes g6 check, f takes at g6, king to e5. And now I could go through the rest of the moves, but I am going to just stop it by demonstrating a rule. If you've got any pawn besides a rook pawn, and you manage to get your king to the 6th rank directly in front of that pawn, it doesn't matter whose move it is. You win. Once white takes this pawn on g6, he will have his king in that position. And black's king is going to be pushed out, and white's eventually going to take the pawn just by pushing him out of the way. So, white wins this endgame. And I should add, even if the rook was on e6, I believe this position would still be eventually winning, but it would require a bit more inventiveness than the method I just showed. I showed a simple example to demonstrate the clear idea why this endgame is winning. Here's another example. I moved the pawn one square forward and put all the pieces on protected squares. But this endgame is not a draw, because white can actually use his queen to push the king out in front of the pawn with like a bunch of checks, and then the king can come in from behind. The reason this is not a draw is because the pawn on f7, there really isn't any way to get behind it. The king either stays right next to it or right behind it, and you can't get behind it. But here, you're able to force the king out, because you have an extra 8th rank to move your queen on. That extra 8th rank allows you to push the king up. So, although the winning method is very complicated, and I will not demonstrate it here, this position is winning for white. Notice that even though black had a very similar setup, the endgame moved from drawn to lost with just a small pawn move. Alright, another interesting fact I would like to mention about fortresses in general is that many computers, if unequipped with endgame table bases, which solve the endgames with 6 or 7 pieces or less, depending on the table base, they often fail to recognize fortresses. Because they look at those positions and they see that one side has a large material advantage, so they give that side a large advantage in the evaluation. Because they cannot recognize that there is no way to convert it into a win, which is a lot easier for a human to notice. So, now that table bases are a thing, this is much less common, but fortresses are one of the only places that humans can outperform computers, like, at all. Certainly not tactics. So overall, are any takeaways from this video? Essentially, fortresses can be a really useful technique if you're trying to defend an endgame down material, but beware that not all that glitters is gold. There may be some way to break through, as was demonstrated in the last 2 examples. Fortresses can rise in many different types of endgames, so always be on the lookout for them. It can be a very useful technique if you're defending, and very infuriating if you're trying to win. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. If there was a fortress you particularly like or something that you have a question about that I did not mention, feel free to mention in the comments. And yeah, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.